Anxiety is always a symptom. Anxiety is never the root cause of a situation. Anxiety is a symptom of a deeper problem, right? So if you're usually looking at the site of the pain, you're usually looking in the wrong area if you're trying to find the root of it. It's kind of like trimming the weeds versus pulling the root. Anxiety is very much the weeds. And what we'll get into with some of these different areas of holistic health would be pulling the root system.
In a world moving faster than our minds were designed to handle, mental health is becoming one of the defining challenges of our time. Welcome to Mental Health in a Modern World with holistic health practitioner Greg Schmaus. After overcoming severe anxiety and OCD in his own life, Greg dedicated the past decade to helping others heal through a fully integrated approach to mental health, combining lifestyle coaching, psycho-emotional healing, mindfulness, and archetypal work. Over the years, he's facilitated thousands of sessions, guiding people back to peace, clarity, and a deeper connection with themselves. Each week, Greg shares powerful solo insights, conversations with leading voices in holistic healing, and immersive live coaching sessions that take you inside the healing process itself. New episodes every Friday. Follow the show and start reclaiming sovereignty over your mind in a modern world. Here's Greg.
Welcome back to Mental Health in a Modern World. So today is going to be a solo episode where we're going to dive into healing an age of anxiety. And this is such an important topic right now because rates of anxiety have really reached an all-time high. I was looking at some statistics the other day, and I found some stats that showed that over a third, around 30 to 33% of US adults are currently experiencing some form of an anxiety disorder. And so anxiety, has risen tremendously in terms of, the rates and the statistics. And a lot of this, seems as though it was escalating around the time of the COVID pandemic. But I think there's, a lot more involved in this epidemic of anxiety, this age of anxiety that our culture is experiencing. And today I wanted to do an episode really kind of peeling back some of the layers and really understanding or supporting you in understanding some of the many root causes of anxiety. And one of the challenges that we see in the Western medical, conventional, traditional approach is to try and look for cures. There's this whole chronic disease epidemic. And when we're trying to look for cures, we're trying to look for this linear A plus B equals C equation, which as human beings, because we're so multidimensional, and like I said in a previous episode, we are biopsychosocial spiritual beings. Since we are so multidimensional, to try and find a this for that cure is really almost impossible. And so that's why understanding this on a holistic level, where we can see the many different root causes that are resulting in enough stress on the organism that the organism is then expressing these symptoms through the body or mind as a stress response and as an adaptation to stress. All right. So today we're going to dive into a lot of these root causes. But just to begin, I'd love to take just a minute or two and do a little meditation with you. And one of the reasons I like starting our solo episodes with some sort of breath work that we did in the last episode and meditation that we do in this solo episode is I want what I'm offering you to be practical. A lot of people listen to podcasts and it's a lot of information, but there's not a lot of practical application that allows you to integrate the information. So I want you to be able to take this information and integrate it into practical application. And so that's why I want to offer you just a very simple, practical meditation, just for about a minute or two, just to begin this journey together. So if you're able to close your eyes while you're listening, please do so. And if you can't, whether it's because you're driving or you're doing something else, then obviously continue what you're doing. But you can actually still practice this meditation as you're listening, even if you are somewhat multitasking as you're along for the ride with us. So if you close your eyes for a moment or just bring your awareness to your breath, I invite you to notice the in-breath and out-breath through your nostrils. So if you bring your awareness to the inside of your nose, noticing the airflow as it moves in and out through the nostrils. And really pay attention to the sensation of the breath, the sensation of the air as it flows in and out through the nostrils. And as we're following the in breath and out breath through the nostrils, in our mind, silently, we're very simply going to count the breath up to 10. So as you inhale, you'll just count in your mind 1. As you exhale, you'll count in your mind 2. As you breathe back in, count in your mind 3. As you breathe out, counting in the mind 4. And making your way up to 10. If you notice your mind wandering or getting distracted with other thoughts, just gently come back to counting the breath up to 10. Once you get to 10, start back at 1, and we'll go one more round up to 10. And then once you finish this last round of 10, you can bring yourself back. This is a very simple and practical meditation. And, from my experience and my perspective, meditation is the practice of sustained attention. It's sustained attention on the present moment, right? So the breath is only happening in the present moment. You can't breathe in the past and you can't breathe in the future. You're always breathing here and now. And so the anchoring of attention on the breath is what anchors your attention on the present moment. And what's really interesting is that a lot of people talk about anxiety always being this mindset of anticipation, right? So a lot of people talk about anxiety always being this anticipatory mindset, always anticipating some potential threat, some potential crisis, some negative outcome. So anxiety is always anticipatory, which is future oriented. A lot of times depression, just kind of going there for a moment, depression is very much past orientation. A lot of times depression comes with the energy of regret, which keeps us tethered to the past, where anxiety is a lot of the energy of anticipation with which keeps us tethered to the future. Right? So depression and anxiety are both expressions of a mind that is either tethered to the past through regret or attached to the future through anticipation. And so meditation is actually the practice of presence. It's actually the practice of bringing yourself back into the here and now through sustained attention on something like the breath, which is always breathing in the here and now. Right? So, this is why sustained attention through the practice of meditation, which brings you into presence, is one of the most important practices for the healing of anxiety. A little background, I mentioned that 20 to 30%, maybe a little bit more, of US adults are experiencing some form of an anxiety disorder. And most of the mainstream treatments in conventional and Western medicine and psychiatry are medications. They're either SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so they work on the serotonin levels of the brain. And there's also SNRIs, which work on serotonin and norepinephrine. And so these are the two most common classifications of medications that are used for anxiety disorders. Now, one thing that I'll say is I'm not against the use of anything. I'm against the misuse of things. From my perspective, the incorrect order of operations. So for me, if one is to use a medication like an SSRI, that to me is a last resort. There's a whole foundation and building blocks of health that must be put into place before we put the cart before the horse, so to speak, with something like a medication. It comes with tremendous side effects and creates patterns of dependency where it's very hard to get off these medications. Legal disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, I can't tell you what to do, but I will say that these medications from my perspective should be a last resort. They should be something that you use after you've exhausted all other mechanisms that have less cost. For example, changing your diet, practicing meditation, getting to sleep on time, exercising, spending more time in nature. There's no downside to those practices. There's no negative side effects. There's no cost to them. There's only benefit. So I'm a big fan of really assessing the cost benefit ratio of any modality and always starting with the least invasive and then working your way up to the most invasive, because the most invasive usually comes with various side effects and has a cost to it. And there's also research that shows that the average placebo is very close to the effectiveness of the medication itself. I was looking at research the other day, and it showed that on average, an SSRI might have a relative improvement of around 50%, maybe 55%. And the average placebo is anywhere between 35 to 40% effective compared to the medication. And so that shows you that the effectiveness of SSRIs is actually quite minimal compared to the effectiveness of a placebo, which a placebo shows you how powerful the mind is, how powerful belief is. If you check out the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, who wrote an amazing book called You Are the Placebo, he really goes into one of the things that gets quite overlooked in the field of Western medicine, which is the real power of the placebo and how that's happening, right? The mind's impact over your physiology, over your neurochemistry, your belief systems, your intention are really the most powerful sources of medicine. Belief and intention are the most powerful things in the world. And what you create in your mind actually starts to shift matter, right? Matter can't organize itself without mind, without an observer, without intention, without information. And so the power of a placebo is incredible. And so we just want to make ourselves aware that, a placebo is almost as powerful as some of the medications that are using and for some of these anxiety and depressive disorders, which is something that you should be very careful with when you see statistics like that in terms of getting on a medication like that, which comes with a lot of side effects and potential cost. So I want to start with the definition of what is anxiety. So I was looking online for just basic definitions because it's really helpful to define these things. So two that I came across is anxiety is an apprehensive uneasiness or nervousness, usually over an impending or anticipated misfortune, right? So that was in the Webster's Dictionary of definition for anxiety. So one of the things I want to point out there is an impending or anticipated misfortune. So anticipation, right? Future orientation. So remember, anxiety is always rooted in a future orientation or a mind that is in a state of anticipation, which is why I introduced that meditation to you, right? So we have that anticipatory ingredient in this definition. And then the other definition, which is a medical definition, is anxiety is an abnormal and overwhelming sense of apprehension and fear, often marked by physiological symptoms concerning a given threat in one's reality and self-doubt about one's capacity to cope with it. So a few things that I want to extract from that definition. Number one is physiological symptoms. So we very often look at anxiety as a mental health disorder, but anxiety is mostly experienced in the body, right? It's a somatic experience. So that's why a lot of the somatic, body oriented, bottom up approach is usually more effective than a top down approach, right? A top down is mind to body, a bottom up is body to mind. It's a two-way highway. And so, based on this medical definition, anxiety is experienced as a physiology or as a physical manifestation, something we experience somatically or in the body. So, this is why bottom up approaches, somatic approaches, and taking care of the health of the body is so important. The next piece is concerning a given threat in one's reality. So, the perception of threat. Now, the perception of threat always ties into the autonomic nervous system, right? So, when we're perceiving threat, we're in a sympathetic fight or flight state, right? The sympathetic fight or flight state is one branch of the autonomic nervous system that is wired for survival, and that gets triggered during times of stress. Now, remember, your body and your nervous system doesn't know the difference between relationship stress, financial stress, or being chased by a lion, right? It always moves you into this sympathetic fight or flight response. And so the perception or the lens that you perceive your reality through are going to be through that lens of anxiety. So anxiety is experienced in the body, right? So bottom up, physiology. And anxiety is also related to the autonomic nervous system. So nervous system dysregulation or nervous system imbalance, right? So those three core ingredients, I just wanted to extract from some of these definitions that anxiety is in the body. Anxiety is always a future orientation or anticipatory aspect of the mind. And then anxiety is an expression of an imbalance in the autonomic nervous system, a dysregulated autonomic nervous system that is predominantly in a sympathetic fight or flight state. It was important for me to really guide you through the extraction of some of those key ingredients in those definitions. So now we're going to get into going through the many root causes of anxiety. And now holistic health is really about getting to the root cause, not treating symptoms, but treating the root cause. And anxiety is always a symptom. Anxiety is never the root cause of a situation. Anxiety is a symptom of a deeper problem, right? So if you're usually looking at the site of the pain, you're usually looking in the wrong area if you're trying to find the root of it, right? It's kind of like trimming the weeds versus pulling the root. Anxiety is very much the weeds. And what we'll get into with some of these different areas of holistic health would be pulling the root system, right? So the first is poor sleep and circadian rhythms, right? So when we have poor sleep and circadian rhythms, we increase cortisol levels, we increase sympathetic nervous system activity, we increase amygdala activity, which is where a lot of the fear and anxiety and sympathetic nervous system activity gets generated. So remember, we said anxiety is a nervous system disorder. So if we have poor sleep and poor circadian rhythms, and we have this increase in stress hormones and increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, we really need to attend to our sleep hygiene, sleep quality, sleep quantity, and really attuning our biology to the natural rising and setting of the sun, which is our circadian rhythm. So that's number one, is poor sleep and poor circadian rhythms. Number two is poor nutrition and poor gut health, right? So nutrition is one of the key factors when it comes to anxiety. And there's a lot of research that shows that anxiety and depression disorders are very much expressions of chronic inflammation. So whenever you create chronic inflammation, a few things happens. You create what's called permeability in the barriers of the body. This is the gut barrier. So your intestinal lining becomes permeable. And also your blood-brain barrier becomes permeable. And this creates this chronic state of inflammation and also raises cortisol levels and keeps the body in this and nervous system in this low level stress response, which a lot of times we're then constantly perceiving our reality through the lens of stress and survival, right? So a few factors we want to take a look at is inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation. So when we have these constant spikes in blood sugar from eating too many processed carbohydrates, processed sugar, and processed food overall, we create even more inflammation when our blood sugar is high, and we create even more cortisol when our blood sugar is low. And this leads to a lot of anxiety. So inflammation, blood sugar dysregulation, and like I said, the leaky gut. And so the gut permeability and the permeability of the blood-brain barrier, creating neural inflammation or inflammation in the brain, also heightens our immune and nervous system responses, creating this constant state of anxiety through the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the last thing I want to touch upon in terms of nutrition and gut health is we talked about earlier that the main medications that are used for anxiety and depression disorders are working on the serotonin pathway. Most psychiatrists are not telling you that 90% of your serotonin is made by your gut bacteria. 90% of your serotonin is not made in your brain, it's made by your gut bacteria. So, one question I have for people that are going to psychiatrists, therapists, how many of them, if you're approaching them with an anxiety disorder, how many of them are asking you about your gut health? How many of them are asking you if you've looked into your microbiome or any patterns of intestinal permeability? Very few. I would say less than 5%. If you go to more metabolic psychiatry, holistic and integrative psychiatry, you're going to find more of that. But generally speaking, very few psychiatrists or clinical therapists are really going to be asking you about your gut health. But the truth is, 90% of these neurotransmitters, such as serotonin, are going to be made by your gut bacteria. So if you have dysbiosis or an imbalance in your gut flora, you're going to have an imbalance in your neurotransmitter production, a deficiency in serotonin production. And so that's something to really attend to is your diet and your gut health. Now, the next piece is sedentary living. We all know this, that exercise is one of the most important things for boosting hormones and neurotransmitters that support mental health. This is dopamine, this is serotonin, this is our endocannabinoids, this is our norepinephrine, this is our endorphin system. All of these hormones and neurotransmitters get released through exercise. So, sedentary living very much relates to a decrease in these neurotransmitter and hormone production, in this hormone and neurotransmitter production that leads to optimal mental health. So, a lot of anxiety and depression disorders can be relieved through proper exercise and movement. The next thing is going to be social media and the news. We all know that I hope we all know by now that social media and the news is one of the worst things for our mental health. 90% of the news is negative for fear based in orientation. And a lot of that is for a reason, because when we pump out negative or fear based information, it triggers a sympathetic fight or flight response. It triggers a hypervigilance that says, I need to know about this for my own survival. And so it creates these patterns of addiction and these patterns of overconsumption and overstimulation. Now, social media very much hijacks our neurochemistry. It hijacks our dopamine system. It depletes us of neurotransmitters. It increases feelings of isolation. It lowers our self esteem. It increases sympathetic nervous system activation. It creates patterns of addiction and it increases what we call FOMO, or the fear of missing out. And it really disconnects you from reality. It disconnects you from nature. It disconnects you from your own body, and it disconnects you from true connection to yourself and others. Relational connection, but also connection to yourself and connection to your own soul, your own consciousness. Social media and technology capture your consciousness. It pulls it out of you. And so you're no longer really embodied or ensouled anymore. You're really captured by a lot of these social media outlets. I don't need to ramble on that anymore. We all know how much social media news increases rates of anxiety and depression. Now, one of the pieces that I'm going to dive into with you that's very often overlooked is chronic infections and environmental toxicity. So, chronic infections such as parasite infections, fungal infections like Candida, Lyme disease, Bartonella, strep, a lot of these low level chronic, I'm not talking about acute infections where you get sick. I'm talking about low level chronic infections, which are usually due to immune suppression, chronic stress, overactive sympathetic nervous system, poor nutrition, poor diet and lifestyle management. The low level chronic infections keep the body and nervous system in a low level stress response all the time. this feeling of unwell, but also what happens, which is really interesting. When we have low level chronic infections, and there are these, we can call them internal pathogens that are creating stress in our physiology, a lot of people aren't aware of where that is coming from. So they project it outside of them. They're looking for some external pathogen or perpetrator to explain why they're feeling the way they are in their own biology. So a lot of people have low level chronic infections that they're not addressing in their own physiology. So they project it outward and look for some external reason as to why they're feeling the dysregulation internally, right? So low level chronic infections and histamine is also one of the leading causes of anxiety. When we have these low level chronic infections, when we have gut permeability, when we have a dysbiosis in our microbiome, it increases levels of histamine in the body, which also leads to a lot of anxiety disorders. Now, when it comes to environmental toxicity, things like chemicals and pesticides, heavy metals, and electromagnetics from non native EMFs all create more stress hormones in the body, more toxicity, things like brain fog, more sympathetic nervous system activity, more permeability in the body and the brain's barriers. And so all of these things express this overall stress load in the organism. And if they're not addressed internally, we perceive the threats outside of us, and it creates high levels of anxiety. So before I move forward, we have sleep and circadian rhythms, we have nutrition and gut health, we have sedentary living and the need for exercise, we have social media and news, we have chronic infections and environmental toxicity, and then we have trauma. Unresolved trauma is one of the leading causes of anxiety, because what happens when we experience trauma is, in a traumatic event, there's a part of our psyche that fragments off, gets frozen in time, and does not move beyond that experience. And that part of our psyche becomes a protector, which is constantly on the lookout for any potential threat that resembles the initial trauma. And it will create a heightened state of anxiety or hypervigilance as a means of trying to protect you from any reoccurring trauma. So, for example, if you were robbed or assaulted by someone wearing a red sweatshirt, anytime your mind sees a red sweatshirt, it's going to activate the fear, stress, or anxiety from that trauma as a way of trying to protect you from any environment, situation, or engagement that might replicate the trauma, right? So trauma creates a protective system that often is expressed as symptoms of anxiety, right? So they're protectors as parts of the psyche that are assigned to protect core wounds, unresolved emotions, and traumas that we've been through in the past, right? So trauma is one of the leading causes of anxiety. With that being said, one of the things that has been a source of contemplation for me for many years is this question of, is anxiety an emotion, or is anxiety the avoidance of emotion? Almost like, is anxiety a feeling, or is anxiety the protector that's keeping you away from feeling a given emotion? Right? So I'm not of the belief that anxiety is an emotion. I'm of the belief that anxiety is a protective system trying to keep you away from feeling a given emotion. Like we said, it's a protector of trauma. So if there's unprocessed grief, unprocessed sadness, unprocessed anger, etc., anxiety is very often the protective system that's trying to keep us away from feeling the sadness, the grief, the anger, etc., that is still unprocessed in our system. And so that's something that I just wanted to distinguish for a moment, that from my perspective, anxiety is not an emotion or feeling. Anxiety is the attempt to avoid an emotion or a feeling, which is what we talked about a moment ago, which is anxiety is usually a built-in protective system as a result of unhealed trauma. Anxiety is often related to what we call attachment injuries. This usually goes back to our childhood. When we're children, we need to try and secure attachments to our primary caretakers, to our parents. And a secure attachment is a sense of a safe connection where we feel seen, we feel heard, we feel valued, we feel attended to, we feel attuned to. And this allows us to feel safe, to settle, for our nervous system to soften. When we have attachment injuries where there's a break in that safe connection to a parent or a primary caretaker, it increases the activity in the amygdala, it increases rates of anxiety, it increases stress hormones, and it leads to anxiety disorders and one of the most common symptoms, which is patterns of addiction. So, from my experience, both personally and professionally, most addiction is rooted in attachment injuries, which that's going to be a follow up episode. I'm going to do a solo episode unpacking the roots of addiction. So, stay tuned for that. We have trauma, we have attachment injuries. And now, the last piece, which is, I would say, the most overlooked, is anxiety is often symptoms of spiritual awakening. So as we're awakening spiritually, we're expanding in consciousness, we're experiencing the multidimensional aspects of ourselves, and we're raising our frequency or vibration. That all has to be integrated into a physiology and into a human nervous system. And anxiety is very often the symptoms of integrating higher frequencies and higher vibrations into a human body and into a human nervous system. And before that integration and embodiment happens, we experience symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of panic, symptoms of, many of the mental health challenges or quote unquote disorders that we are seeing in this current mental health crisis. A lot of is actually symptoms of spiritual awakening. And I'm also going to do a follow up episode on the connection between mental health and spirituality and the connection between our mental health crisis and spiritual awakening. So stay tuned for that as well. So, spiritual awakening can very often come with symptoms of anxiety as these higher frequencies, higher dimensions, and higher vibrational states are integrating into the physiology and into the human nervous system. Right. So, just in summary, when it comes to root causes of anxiety, we have sleep and circadian rhythms, we have nutrition and gut health, we have sedentary living and the need for more exercise, we have social media, news, technology. We have chronic infections and environmental toxicity. We have unresolved trauma. We have attachment injuries. And we have symptoms of spiritual awakening. And this is why taking a holistic approach to mental health and anxiety is absolutely essential, and why looking for a cure is not possible. You can't look for a cure in an organism and a situation that is so multifactorial, where one person's anxiety is rooted in an attachment trauma, another person's anxiety is rooted in a parasite infection, another person's anxiety is rooted in poor sleep, and another person's anxiety is rooted in excess consumption of social media and technological information through, let's say, news outlets. So you could see, how can you find a this for that cure when we're so multidimensional and the root causes can come from so many different areas? That's why healing rather than curing is really the only path forward when it comes to this current mental health crisis, but really the chronic disease crisis at large. So, this is why healing versus curing is so important to understand. And it's never a this for that linear left brain type mentality. This is why the use of the right brain is so essential, because the right brain can see the whole, where the left brain can only see isolated parts. And unfortunately, most Western medicine, which has its value in acute traumatic care, falls short when it comes to healing chronic disease because it's too left brain dominant. It's either this for that, it's A plus B equals C, and it overlooks the whole and it just isolates the parts. So, when it comes to healing anxiety, where do we start? Well, number one, eat a whole unprocessed food diet, eat organic food, eat food that lowers inflammation, that stabilizes your blood sugar, that supports the health of your microbiome. Optimize your circadian rhythms. Get to bed by 10 p.m. Rise with the rising of the sun. Go to bed, a few hours after the setting of the sun. So the more you schedule your day and prioritize your sleep with the rising and setting of the sun, the more you tune your system with nature. So that's number two. Number three is exercise and move your body daily. That goes without saying. Number four, Have a daily meditation practice, a daily breathwork practice to really practice presence, sustained attention, and to bring that nervous system activation down, bring yourself back into a parasympathetic state. Number 5, spend less time on devices. Pretty straightforward. Number 6, spend more time in nature. Pretty straightforward. As you can see, healing anxiety can be pretty straightforward if you set the foundation, the building blocks first, and then after that, then you can go more into specialty treatments and the possible use of medications. But please do not put the cart before the horse. Eat whole unprocessed food, optimize your circadian rhythms, exercise, move your body daily, have a daily meditation or breathwork practice, spend less time on devices and spend more time in nature. And I promise you, this will take you miles in your progress along your healing journey with anxiety. And then if you need, extra support, whether it's through medication, through therapy, through coaching, that's something that you can explore. If you would like to explore this further with me, you can go to my website, healing40.com. You can reach out to me for one on one coaching. I also have my online program, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is a 21-day mental health program. It takes a fully holistic approach to mental health. It dives into all of the factors that we're talking about today and so much more. And it takes you on this 21-day journey through a lot of diet and lifestyle shifts and a lot of practical tools and healing techniques, just like the meditation that I took you through, earlier in the episode. You also have the breathwork practice in my last solo episode. So there's a lot of resources here for you. So healing40.com for one-on-one coaching, healing40.com/HTM for the Healing the Mind program. You can use the code podcast at checkout to save 20% off. And I look forward to sharing more with you in a future episode. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. If you enjoyed this video and this episode, please like, subscribe, share it with anyone that you feel might be supported by this content. We have an epidemic of anxiety. This is an age of anxiety. And so I'm sure you know people that are struggling with some of the challenges that we spoke about today. So it means a lot to me if we spread the love and share the message. We need all hands on deck right now to support people in their healing. And so I appreciate you taking the time to go on this journey with me. And once again, I look forward to sharing more with you soon in a future episode. Bye bye.